Have you ever had an online relationship? Dating apps nowadays help us a lot in the journey of finding a partner in life. I know so many couples who have a wonderful relationship and marriage by using this app. They swap right in the dating app, connect each other through messages, hang out in real life and decide to marry. What an option we have! In the modern world, intimacy has evolved significantly from its medieval roots. No longer confined by rigid societal roles, intimacy today is largely shaped by individual choice and emotional connection. Where medieval relationships were often driven by duty, marriage as a means to secure alliances and family, contemporary love is grounded in personal desire and mutual respect. The rise of individualism and the decline of traditional, arranged marriages have allowed intimacy to be defined by personal connections rather than social obligation. Sexual liberation and feminism have played a crucial role in redefining intimacy. Women's autonomy over their bodies, a key achievement of modern feminist movements, has allowed for greater sexual freedom and the ability to choose partners based on emotional and physical attraction. This shift has also given rise to more inclusive definitions of love and sexuality, embracing LGBTQ+ relationships and non-binary identities, which were once invisible or severely repressed. The rise of technology has further transformed intimacy, particularly through dating apps and online communication. While these digital platforms enable quick connections, they also present challenges like superficial interactions and unrealistic expectations. Nevertheless, technology has expanded the ways in which people connect, even across long distances, making intimacy accessible in new forms. At the same time, emotional intimacy has taken center stage in modern relationships. Unlike the transactional nature of medieval marriages, today's relationships often prioritize trust, communication, and emotional connection. Therapy and open conversations about mental health have made it easier for people to navigate complex feelings within romantic partnerships. Despite these advances, modern intimacy is not without challenges. The pressures of modern life, the rise of digital disconnection, and the pursuit of individual fulfillment constrain relationships. However, the fundamental human desire for connection remains. Today, intimacy is seen as a deeply personal journey, one that continues to evolve with time, offering new opportunities for love and connection. In modern times, intimacy is characterized by personal choice, emotional connection, and mutual respect. Where love forms the foundation of romantic relationships, people seek emotional and physical fulfillment, with relationships often built on equality and open communication. Sexual autonomy is central, and intimacy is shaped by individual desires, with technology playing a major role in connecting people through online platforms and digital communication. This contrasts with medieval times when intimacy was defined by societal norms, religious doctrines, and the need for marriage to secure family and social stability, where love was secondary to duty and procreation. Women's sexuality was strictly controlled, and courtly love was often idealized as an unattainable or chaste longing. In the shadowy halls of castles and the quiet corners of peasant homes, in the flicker of candlelight and the echo of church bells, love in the Middle Ages wore many faces, some devout, some desperate, and some daring. From the 5th to the 15th century, medieval Europe was a world deeply shaped by religion, tradition, and hierarchy. At first glance, it may seem like a world of rigid control, where intimacy was bound tightly by religious dogma and societal rules. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find that beneath the surface, people longed, loved, and lusted in ways surprisingly similar to us today. This was a time when marriage was as much a contract as it was a union of hearts. A time when troubadours wrote poetry for noble women they could never touch, when scholars debated whether women enjoyed sex, and when the church, trying desperately to contain human nature, issued rule after rule, often ignored. In monasteries and marketplaces, in royal courts and rustic fields, the stories of love and intimacy played out with passion, secrecy, and sometimes scandal. Some people clung to their vows, others risked their reputations or their lives for forbidden affection. Love could be a divine experience or a defiant act. This story isn't just about sex, though that's part of it. It's about connection, how people found it, feared it, and fought for it. It's about the ways society tried to draw strict lines around love, only to find that the heart rarely listens. In this journey through medieval Europe, we'll explore how people married, flirted, sinned, and stayed faithful. We'll visit brothels and cathedrals, read love letters and law codes, and hear voices, both noble and ordinary, who lived, loved, and left their mark on history. Welcome to a world where passion met piety and where intimacy was never simple. In medieval Europe, marriage was not just a personal affair. It was a vital institution that governed much of life. It was a strategic alliance, a political tool, and in many ways, a social necessity. For the peasantry, the aristocracy, and even the church itself, marriage was deeply tied to the control of property, bloodlines, and the stability of kingdoms. Yet within this framework, marriage was also about love, of a sort, and about the delicate negotiation of intimacy and sexual expectations. The church, ever watchful, set strict rules for marriage. According to the teachings of St. Augustine, sexual relations within marriage were permitted, but only for procreation. Any sexual act outside the confines of a married couple with the goal of producing children was considered sinful. The medieval ideal, enforced through canon law, was one of chastity outside marriage and sexual abstinence during fasting or religious festivals. But life on the ground didn't always follow these rules. People were human, after all. The idea that sexual desire was inherently sinful unless properly channeled into procreation didn't stop medieval men and women from experiencing pleasure or seeking emotional connection through sex. In fact, while many marriages were arranged, some couples grew to love each other. Letters from nobles like the letters of Heloise and Abelard reveal that love and passion were as present in medieval marriages as any political arrangement. The church may have kept strict control over marital practices, but the heart often defied the rules. For most people in the medieval world, marriage wasn't about romantic love, it was about alliance, duty, and survival. The wealthy often used marriage to seal political deals or land claims, while peasants saw marriage as a way to secure stability and legal rights. In the absence of birth control, fertility was crucial, and it was an expectation, if not always a success, that marriage would lead to children. The number of children one had was a reflection of one's ability to uphold societal expectations, and childlessness could lead to accusations of infertility or even impotence. In fact, marriage disputes were common. Church courts often intervened in cases of infertility, where one partner was accused of being unable to produce heirs. It wasn't just a matter of emotional turmoil, it was a matter of legal legitimacy and social status. Cases of impotence trials were regularly held in the ecclesiastical courts, and the rules about what constituted valid sexual relations were quite specific. A marriage could be annulled if it had not been consummated properly. But what of love? And what about the intimacy that comes from sexual desire? Was it absent from medieval marriages? Not at all. In fact, many couples, especially among the peasantry, found ways to express affection and intimacy. While noble marriages may have been driven by politics, commoners often relied on each other for emotional and sexual fulfillment. The courtly ideal of marriage may have been cold and utilitarian, but in the homes of peasants, love and affection could flourish alongside the demands of work and family. Marriage, in its most basic form, was about partnership. In many ways, it was about necessity, securing land, goods, and heirs. But in practice, it was also about companionship and mutual dependence. Couples often found ways to enjoy each other's company, whether through shared work, mutual respect, or, yes, sexual intimacy. After all, marriage wasn't solely about having children, it was also about finding a partner to share the burdens of life. The medieval marriage bed, it turns out, was a place not just for procreation, but for connection. In the medieval world, marriage was a complex contract, a contract filled with spiritual, legal, and personal implications. It was often fraught with expectations, fears, and even failure. But it also held the promise of affection, mutual support, and the potential for intimacy. Though it may have been bound by law and custom, the power of love, however it was understood, remained a force that no amount of canon law could entirely control. In the shadow of rigid societal norms and the ever-watchful eyes of the church, there emerged a fascinating, almost paradoxical tradition: courtly love. Courtly love didn't just challenge the conventions of marriage and sexuality, it reshaped them entirely. Unlike the structured, pragmatic view of marriage where sex was tied to procreation, courtly love celebrated the emotional, spiritual, and sometimes physical longing between knights and noblewomen, though always veiled in secrecy and idealism. Courtly love emerged during the 12th century in the courts of southern France, particularly in the Duchy of Aquitaine. Poets, known as troubadours, were at the forefront of this cultural movement, writing songs and poems that idealized the unattainable woman, often a married noblewoman, as the object of the knight's affections. These poems were filled with lofty metaphors and allegorical language, emphasizing selflessness, devotion, and loyalty, sometimes at the expense of the knight's own desires. Courtly love was about aspiring to an unattainable ideal, and through that aspiration, elevating the soul. It was as much about spiritual elevation as it was about earthly desire. One of the earliest examples of courtly love in literature is found in the work of Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century author and cleric. In his book, De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love, Capellanus outlined the rules of courtly love, which included principles like love is always a secret and love cannot exist without jealousy. The rules were rigorous, creating a code of conduct that defined the relationship between the lover and his lady. The lover was often expected to perform feats of bravery, humility, or loyalty to prove his devotion. Yet, love was never consummated in the physical sense. This was love without a sexual climax. It was about longing, sacrifice, and the spiritual connection between the knight and his lady. While Capellanus codified these ideals, the tradition of courtly love is perhaps best known through the legendary stories of Tristan and Isolde and Lancelot and Guinevere. These tales, though they were works of fiction, had a profound impact on how love was understood in the courts of medieval Europe. In these stories, love is presented as a force that transcends reason and duty, often leading to tragedy. For instance, in the Tristan and Isolde legend, Tristan, a knight, falls in love with Isolde, a woman betrothed to his uncle, King Mark. Their love is forbidden, yet it consumes both of them, showing the tension between love as an ideal and the constraints of marriage. But courtly love was not merely confined to poetry and legends, it influenced real-world behavior as well. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period, is often associated with the ideals of courtly love. As the queen consort of both Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, Eleanor was at the centre of European courts where courtly love flourished. She encouraged the culture of troubadours and the performance of chivalric feats, and her court became a symbol of the idealized romanticism of the time. Eleanor's own tumultuous relationship with Henry II, marked by infidelities and political intrigue, mirrored the contradictions inherent in the courtly love tradition, a love that was passionate but often fraught with complications and consequences. Courtly love also played a role in the Arthurian legends, stories that would become foundational to European notions of chivalry and love. Sir Lancelot's forbidden love for Queen Guinevere, his king's wife, encapsulates the contradictions of courtly love. While Lancelot is celebrated for his prowess and loyalty, his love for Guinevere ultimately leads to the fall of Camelot, making his love both idealized and disastrous. These romantic ideals weren't always practical, nor were they universally accepted. The Church, ever suspicious of such worldly matters, decried courtly love as adulterous and sinful. In fact, many Church fathers, such as St. Bernard of Clairvaux, criticized the ideal of unattainable love as a distraction from spiritual devotion. Yet, despite these religious condemnations, courtly love endured. Its influence reached beyond the courts, shaping the ways that men and women thought about love, desire, and romantic longing for centuries to come. In truth, courtly love was a complex phenomenon, one that both revered and rejected the physical act of sex. While it promoted ideals of romantic devotion, it often existed within the boundaries of a sexual society that demanded marriage for procreation and social order. Its paradoxical nature, idealizing a love that was often forbidden and unconsummated, mirrors the tension between human passion and societal expectations. The stories of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, and Eleanor of Aquitaine all illustrate that in the medieval period, love wasn't just a contract between individuals or a duty. It was an aspiration, a yearning for something higher, something beyond the ordinary. Courtly love allowed the medieval world to dream of a love that was pure, transcendent, and ultimately unattainable, yet deeply rooted in the very fabric of its society. In the medieval period, sexuality was tightly bound to ideas of gender, morality, and social order. The Church, with its deep influence on daily life, dictated that the sexual body, particularly the female body, was something to be controlled, contained, and regulated. While the Church idealized virginity for both men and women, the focus on female purity was especially pronounced. Women's sexuality was viewed with suspicion and fear, portrayed as a force that, if left unchecked, could lead men and society astray. But beneath these rigid ideologies, medieval people navigated complex sexual lives, full of desire, repression, and occasional rebellion. Women in medieval sexuality. Women in medieval Europe were often defined by their relationship to men, either as daughters, wives, or nuns. In the eyes of the Church, the ideal woman was a virgin, and once married, she was expected to be a dutiful wife, giving herself to her husband solely for procreation. The notion of female chastity was sacred. Virginity was not only a symbol of purity, but also a vital currency for marriage. A virgin bride was considered more valuable, and a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to remain chaste before marriage. However, despite this ideal, women's desires were acknowledged, albeit reluctantly. The confession and penitentials, manuals for priests on how to absolve sins, often included sins of the flesh that addressed female desires, particularly masturbation and adultery. In fact, medieval theologians such as Thomas Aquinas considered women to be more prone to lust and physical temptation than men, a view that reinforced gendered norms and justified the strict policing of female sexuality. But the reality of women's experiences was more complex. Women often defied these strictures, whether through extramarital affairs, same-sex relationships, or in their everyday sexual practices. Historical evidence reveals instances of women, such as Heloise, who defied religious norms by pursuing a passionate, intellectual, and physical relationship with the monk Abelard, a love that would tragically shape their lives forever. Their correspondence, especially the letters of Heloise, reflect a profound understanding of desire, love, and sexual autonomy, challenging the traditional image of the medieval woman as a passive, controlled entity. The medical view of women's sexuality. The medieval medical community, largely influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, held a view of women as inherently weaker, both physically and morally. Physicians believed that women were ruled by their bodies rather than their minds. Their sexuality, seen as more animalistic and uncontrolled, was frequently labelled as dangerous. For instance, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic and scholar, wrote that women's bodies were more susceptible to lust and needed to be kept in check. Men and sexuality. For men, sexuality was more fluid in medieval thought. While celibacy and chastity were idealized for clergy and aristocrats, secular men had more freedom in their sexual lives, as long as they remained within certain social boundaries. Noblemen often had concubines, and extramarital affairs were not uncommon. Prostitution, while condemned by the Church, was viewed by many as a necessary evil to prevent men from committing adultery or engaging in more harmful sexual behaviors, such as sodomy. Despite these freedoms, male sexuality was also subject to moral oversight. The Church's teachings on sexuality were strict. Men were encouraged to marry and use sex solely for procreation, but the temptation of the flesh was still something to be resisted. The confessions of kings and nobles, such as King Henry VIII of England, reveal the tension between desire and religious dictates. Henry's many marriages and extramarital affairs were motivated by his desire for an heir, but they also underscored the contradictions of medieval sexual mores. Same-sex desire and sexual norms. Medieval views on same-sex desire were harsh and often violent. Homosexuality, or more accurately, the act of sodomy, was considered one of the gravest of sins. The Church's stance on same-sex acts was rooted in biblical injunctions and its teachings on procreation. Sodomy was seen not only as immoral, but as a perversion of the natural order. In fact, during the Middle Ages, Peter Damian, a cardinal and monastic reformer, wrote fiercely against sodomy, calling it a heinous sin that threatened the soul. Those convicted of sodomy could face severe punishment, often execution, especially during the later medieval period. However, despite the official condemnation, same-sex desire existed in medieval Europe. Love letters between knights and their companions, and even between monks, hint at forms of homoerotic affection. The legendary friendship of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, though framed as a platonic tale of chivalric honour, has been interpreted by modern scholars as a narrative that also conveys male intimacy and affection. The idea of brotherhood in the monastic world sometimes carried undertones of romantic affection, though this was never openly acknowledged. Medieval gender roles and sexual identity. Gender in the medieval period was defined by rigid roles that were intertwined with expectations of sexual behaviour. Men were expected to be the active agents in sexual relationships, while women were expected to be passive. This binary understanding of gender served to regulate not only sexual activity, but also the very way in which people understood their own identities. Women's sexuality was often framed as dangerous and needing control, while men's sexuality was viewed as a necessary part of their masculinity. Yet, this framework left little room for the complexity of individual desire. Medieval women, such as Christine de Pizarro, pushed against these restrictions, advocating for women's agency in both love and politics. De Pizarro's works, such as The Book of the City of Ladies, argued for the value of women as intellectual and sexual equals to men, challenging the assumptions of gendered sexual power. Her writings continue to resonate today, reminding us of the medieval struggle for sexual autonomy and equality. The medieval period, then, was a time of extreme control and expression, of rules and rebellion. While the church and legal authorities sought to tightly regulate sexuality and gender, human desire found ways to break through. Whether through the passionate letters of Heloise, the stories of same-sex affection, or the chivalric ideals of love, medieval people expressed their sexuality in complex and diverse ways. Even as society sought to suppress it, the natural urge for intimacy and connection remained an indelible part of the human experience. Medieval Europe had a peculiar relationship with prostitution. Officially, the Church condemned it as sinful, a stain on the moral fabric of society. Yet, in practice, prostitution was often tolerated, regulated, and even incorporated into urban life. This paradox highlights the tension between religious ideals and the realities of medieval human nature. The Church, in its effort to curb sin, eventually came to see prostitution as a necessary evil, a lesser evil, to be sure, but one that helped prevent greater sexual transgressions like adultery or sodomy. The role of prostitution in medieval society. Prostitution in medieval cities was far from hidden. It was, in many ways, an open secret. Towns and cities across Europe, like Paris, London, Florence, and Avignon, had designated districts for sex work. These areas, often known as red light districts, were officially recognized and regulated by local authorities. In places like 12th century Paris, prostitutes were confined to specific areas, sometimes even to specific streets. This system of regulation was a pragmatic attempt to control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases and maintain public order. One notable example of such regulation comes from Avignon, where papal authorities acknowledged the necessity of prostitution and, in some cases, even taxed it. The papacy, in its attempts to contain sexual vice, imposed strict rules on brothels and prostitution. This regulation was not born out of a concern for the women involved, but rather as a means of managing and containing the dangers of unchecked sexuality. Prostitutes were required to register with authorities, and brothels were inspected for cleanliness. The idea was to curb more destructive behaviours, like adultery or incest, by providing an outlet for male sexual desire in a controlled environment, brothel regulation, and social control. The regulation of prostitution was largely a way for medieval authorities to control public morality. In many cases, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive clothing, often brightly coloured, so they could be easily identified. In cities like Florence, prostitutes were required to wear specific signs or badges marking them as fallen women. This public identification served two purposes. It stigmatized the women involved while also making them visible to authorities. This visibility allowed the state and church to monitor and control their activities more effectively. The church's stance on prostitution was complex. On one hand, it condemned it as sinful. On the other hand, it tacitly accepted it, acknowledging its presence as a necessary part of society. Medieval theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas justified the existence of prostitution as a form of containment. He argued that it prevented men from engaging in more sinful behaviors, such as adultery or the sodomitical acts prohibited by the Church. For the Church, the goal was to manage sexual sin, not necessarily to eliminate it altogether. Women in prostitution. The women who worked as prostitutes came from various walks of life. Some women chose prostitution due to economic necessity, as it offered a way to survive in a harsh world. Others were forced into sex work, often as a result of poverty or familial circumstances. Many women were sold into prostitution or became sex workers after being abandoned by husbands or families. In some cases, young girls were trafficked, and their lives were marked by exploitation and abuse. These women were often seen as the lowest tier of society, with few legal rights or protections. Despite their marginalization, however, some women found a degree of solidarity among themselves. In certain cities, prostitutes banded together for mutual protection, particularly against violence or harassment by customers. In some medieval legal systems, prostitutes were afforded limited rights. For example, if a prostitute were assaulted by a client, she could, in some places, seek legal recourse. This, however, was far from the norm, and for the most part, sex workers were left to navigate a brutal world alone. The Church's approach to prostitution was marked by hypocrisy. While it officially condemned sex work, it also recognized its importance in society, often turning a blind eye to its prevalence. In some ways, the regulation of prostitution allowed the Church and secular authorities to maintain control over the moral fabric of society without acknowledging the real struggles of women involved in sex work. The legacy of prostitution in medieval culture. Despite the Church's moral condemnation, prostitution had a significant place in medieval culture. In literature, prostitution is often depicted as a sign of social degradation. Yet in some stories, prostitutes were also portrayed as figures of sympathy, representing the plight of women who had few choices in a patriarchal society. For example, in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the character of the wife of Bath provides an insightful commentary on female sexuality, sexual autonomy, and the power dynamics between men and women in relationships. While not a prostitute in the strictest sense, she uses her sexual power to control her marriages, defying traditional gender roles. In contrast, other works like Boccaccio's Decameron depict women in prostitution as symbols of moral decay. The moral judgments in these works reflect the broader societal attitudes towards sex work. It was a necessary evil, but one that was inextricably tied to sin and shame. However, they also illuminate the ways in which society viewed women's sexual agency as inherently corrupting. Ultimately, prostitution in medieval Europe was a complex, multifaceted issue. While it was officially condemned by the Church and often stigmatized by society, it was also regulated, controlled, and incorporated into urban life as a means of managing the sexual desires of men. It existed in a grey area, where religious ideals clashed with the realities of human desire and survival. In medieval Europe, same-sex desire existed, but it was hidden beneath layers of shame, sin, and fear. The Church, with its powerful moral authority, condemned homosexual acts as a grave sin, often equating them with heresy. The term sodomy became a blanket term for any non-procreative sexual act, and same-sex relations were seen not only as immoral, but as a direct affront to God's order. Yet, despite this condemnation, same-sex relationships were far from uncommon. They existed in the margins of medieval society, often in secret, sometimes in plain sight, but always surrounded by legal and religious repression. The medieval church was unequivocal in its stance on same-sex relations, especially between men. The teachings of the Church Fathers, such as Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas, placed sodomy in the category of the most severe sins. In the 12th and 13th centuries, church law codified this stance, with councils like the Lateran councils passing decrees that criminalized same-sex acts and laid out punishments that included excommunication, penance, and, in extreme cases, execution. Same-sex desire in the context of brotherhood. Despite the religious prohibitions, same-sex desire was not entirely invisible in medieval culture. Many male friendships in the medieval period, particularly among the clergy and knights, were marked by a deep intimacy that transcended the Platonic. Monasticism, in particular, created an environment where intense emotional bonds could form between men. The Latin phrase amiciti, friendship, was used to describe these close bonds, but scholars and historians have suggested that some of these relationships may have been more than just affectionate friendships. The famous friendship between Saint Aelred of Rievaulx and his fellow monks has been the subject of much debate among modern scholars. Aelred wrote about friendship in his book Speculum Caritatis, The Mirror of Charity, detailing the ideal of love between friends, which some interpreters suggest may have hinted at homoerotic undertones. Though Aelred himself never explicitly condoned same-sex relationships, his writings emphasize the deep emotional and spiritual connection that could exist between two men. It's important to note, however, that medieval conceptions of friendship and love were not the same as modern ideas of sexual identity. In medieval Europe, sexual health was a concept far from the scientific understanding we have today. Rooted in ancient Greek and Roman medical traditions, medieval medical knowledge was based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humours were believed to govern the body's functions, and imbalance in them could lead to illness, including sexual dysfunction. The concept of the humours was deeply intertwined with medieval understandings of sexuality, fertility, and desire, shaping the ways in which people approached their bodies and sexual health. The desire for children, especially male heirs, was a powerful motivator in medieval society. As such, much of the medical advice regarding sexual health was focused on fertility. Women were often prescribed diets, herbal remedies, and specific sexual practices to improve their chances of conception. Some medieval texts, like the famous Trotula, a 12th century medical work written by women for women, included instructions on how to treat infertility and regulate menstrual cycles. These texts also offered remedies for painful sex, a common problem among women due to rigid, ill-fitting garments or general sexual discomfort. Contraception, although officially condemned by the Church, was practiced in various forms. Women used herbal remedies, such as silphium, an herb known for its contraceptive properties, or pessaries made from honey, olive oil, and other ingredients. These methods were far from foolproof, but they represented a pragmatic response to the realities of sexual life. Even though church authorities strictly prohibited contraception, it continued to be widely used, especially among common people who desired to limit family size or avoid the risks of childbirth. The medieval period also saw the emergence of venereal diseases, which were poorly understood at the time. Syphilis, though its exact origin is debated, is believed to have spread through Europe in the late 15th century, but earlier forms of sexual diseases, including gonorrhea and herpes, were likely prevalent as well. Medieval physicians didn't fully understand how these diseases were transmitted, but they often associated them with moral failings or divine punishment. Treatments for these ailments ranged from herbal remedies to more extreme methods. Bloodletting, a common medieval treatment for various ailments, was also employed in attempts to purge the body of toxins caused by sexual diseases. In some cases, physicians would recommend the use of mercury, a substance that was believed to treat syphilis, though it was highly toxic and often made the situation worse. Remedies like these reflect the medieval understanding of the body as an intricate, yet deeply flawed, system that could be rebalanced through a mixture of herbal remedies, ritual, and sometimes dangerous treatments. And with that, dear listener, we gently close the final page of tonight's journey through a shimmering past. Whether you now dream of silken gowns or scented pomanders, may your sleep be sweet and your imagination soft as velvet. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.